Thank you all for joining us today for this session on ArcGIS Online Best Practices for High Demand Web Applications. Now, you're going to notice a couple things that might be different from your agenda. The name of the session, we actually modified to include a broader discussion than just layers, because most likely the layers that you're creating in ArcGIS Online are going to be accessed through some sort of application by your end users. So we really wanted to broaden that discussion a little bit. Secondly, you'll probably see some names in the agenda as presenters that are not here. Kelly Juro Wilcox and John Petter were originally supposed to deliver this session, but unfortunately they couldn't be here today. So myself and Beth are filling in for them. So I'll just introduce myself briefly. My name's Bonnie Stayer. I'm a solution engineer with Esri's national government team in Washington, D.C. And I support a lot of users that are working in ArcGIS Online. And I'll let Beth introduce herself.
My name is Beth Romero. I'm on the ArcGIS Online team out of Denver. And yeah, let's go ahead and get started. All right, to give you a quick overview of what we're going to talk about today, we're going to open it up with talking about communicating with maps. Then we're going to talk a little bit about just planning. Who do you build your apps for? Going through the planning phase can really help you make better decisions when it gets to talking about layer types, scalability and response caching. There's different types of tiles that you can use, visualization strategies. There's different things you can take advantage of. And then finally, we'll talk about sharing your app, layers, and map with the public. Some things to always double check when you do that. All right, so communicating with maps. Maps have always been a powerful communication tool. They were previously printed and distributed in publications and newspapers, and that had to be manually distributed. Technology has now evolved, and computers and the internet are the primary resource used to create, share, and consume maps. This makes it easy to tell your story and to update resources quickly. When you're printing something, you'd have to go through that entire process again. And we're going to talk about why web applications are great, because you can quickly update them and distribute them. So mapping on the web, let's just think about embedding a map into an existing website. You have two options, really. You can use a static image, maybe a screenshot of the map you've created, or you could put it in a web application and embed that in there. When you use web applications to share your maps and data, they're interactive. So you can zoom in, explore things in detail, view attribute data, access things through the pop-up, add existing media like charts and graphs and images. They're really easily accessible by any audience. You can consume them on a computer, through any device. You can integrate some existing media, like I mentioned, images, charts, graphs. And this creates a spatial dialogue with you and your audience. So they can kind of maybe pick an area of interest and dig into that area a little bit more instead of just viewing a static image. And they're fast to build and really easy to distribute. So the web app architecture starts at the layer level. Layers, that's the mapping data you want to display and have your users interact with. So that's operational layers, any type of base map. And Bonnie's actually going to get into the different types of layers and how you can optimize them for high demand. Once you have your layers, then you will put that into a web map. This is where you can make some design choices through symbology, configure a pop-up so your users are directed to the most important information that you want to share. And then finally, the web app. The web app lets you add in different tools that may help allow your audience to explore and take advantage of the web map that you've created. So this session was called Best Practices for High Demand Layers. When layers go viral, they're typically in a web application. People aren't going into ArcGIS Online and searching for the hottest layer. They're accessing a configured layer in a web map. And it's important that that configured layer is able to stand the load if you have a high demand application. So think of things embedded into maybe a CNN website, volcano lava flow that's been shared in a web page, or the Tour de France showing highlights along the route. So now we're going to talk a little bit about the planning phase. Who do you build your web apps for? So consider your audience. And this can really be a variety. Maybe you have a small select group of GIS analysts. Maybe it's just going to be within your own organization. Or maybe you're going to open it up to the entire world and you're going to post it on Twitter and try to share it with as many people as possible. Or it could be for a local community, but everybody is going to access this. This time of year we talk about wildfires a lot. People can access a web application that can show them, am I in an evacuation zone? Where are the shelters? And then emergency responders can get resources quickly through any device, really. The next thing you're going to want to think about is, what is the purpose of this app? What design strategies can be applied to support the purpose? Is there data they need to access through a pop-up? Or can information be primarily communicated through just visualization? Are you extracting information from the audience? Will later need to be editable so they can share specific information with you? Are there certain tools they'll need? Are they going to be routing anything? Having a clear purpose going into the design phase is really going to help you make specific decisions like pop-up, symbology, and then finally deciding on specific layer types. Probably the reason most of us are here today is, what is the performance expectation? I think we can all agree that you want things to load fast, especially if it's going to be high demand. Slow loading apps and layers don't typically even make it to high demand. And understanding your audience is going to be key here too. Maybe this isn't going to be shared with everybody and it's going to be just GIS analysts and it's complex data. They may have a higher threshold for how long it takes to load, but typically people are going to want to see something in probably under 3 seconds. So for this presentation, we're going to move forward with a couple assumptions: that the audience is the entire world, the performance, so you want the app to load quickly, no more than 3 seconds. All your components need to withstand about 1,000 requests per second. And then for functionality, users can figure out tools without instructions. So anything you add into that web application, they need to be able to use without having multiple clicks searching around. These are some things to keep in mind. And this brings us to kind of 3 general areas: functionality, performance, and usability. So what is the purpose? Usability, what tools are you going to include for them, either accessible through the web map or the application, and how are they going to interact with it? And then finally, performance, how long is this going to take to load or get the results? And I think there's kind of give and take in each area, but you want to find a nice overlap where it's usable, you're still sending the clear purpose, it's functional, but it's performing well. All right, so this brings us to a demo where we're going to kind of compare things of who wore it better, what app was better. I wish I could say that was my cat, but it is not, unfortunately. All right, let's take a look at some apps.
I think you need to pull off the presentation. Like get out of presenter view.
There we go. Okay, so the intended experience of this one is we want visitors to be able to visit this map and really understand the gender wage gap in a specific country. So for this one, I'm going to just type in Mexico. I see a suggestion. I'm going to take it. This takes me to the country of Mexico. The info panel is displaying the information that I want to share. This pop-up has been configured really nicely. It says quickly in a sentence, the gender gap is 18.3%. Here's the same app, map. I'm going to do the same thing again. Mexico. So here it takes me to the geographic region of Mexico. I need to actually click on the feature, and then I will see the pop-up information. So this is kind of a usability where you can make some tweaks from this app right here to the one I just showed, using layer level search within the web map. That's just going to remove one click that people need to do. All right, let's take a look at another one. So this is something that's happening right now. I want to be able to search an address. Yep, And I want to see if I'm in an evacuation zone. So here I get my search result. I can clearly see the location is currently under mandatory evacuation status. Here's the same map. The extent is different. There's additional layers. It opens up a layer list. But I want to do the same thing. I want to be able to find if I'm in an evacuation zone. So I have to come find this Near Me tool. Put my address in. I get the same information back. I'm under a mandatory evacuation zone. But when I opened it up right away, the map was kind of busy. The extent was further out. And I would have to know exactly what this tool was here to access it. So just a couple of things that you can tweak in the design when you're configuring an app to maybe have a specific tool open right away that you want them to use. This is going to reduce the number of clicks and I think make the audience a little more successful. All right, so I'm going to reload this map. The purpose of this map is I just want to visualize earthquakes. That's all. I want a nice looking map. I want to visualize it. So the map on the left has a tile layer, and the map on the right is a hosted feature layer. And you'll see it's coming in. I think we timed it before. It took about like 15-ish seconds for the entire thing to draw. For visualization purposes, a tile service would be much more performant than having hosted feature layers, especially considering I'm not having my audience gather any information other than just looking at the map. All right. So the intended use of this one is I want my audience to be able to see precipitation forecast. So in here, I'm just going to reload it. This is a time-aware app. I can come in here, and I can see the precipitation forecast. I can go through this. This is using a subscription layer available through ArcGIS Online. Here's the same app. I'm going to reload it. And I'm being prompted to sign in. Subscription layers are going to prompt people to sign in. Within the configurable app, you can set a proxy so that they don't have to sign in. So simple things like that to just kind of keep in mind if you're going to be sharing this with the public. This is definitely going to deter some people who just want to see a map and they're like, ArcGIS Online, what's this? I need a login, and they're probably just going to bail. So that's kind of some examples of functionality, usability, and performance, just having a nice balance between all of them and making the appropriate decisions.
Thanks, Beth. Switch over to my machine now. All right, so I'm going to continue on and talk about some layer types and get into specific information about these different layer types. So first we're going to start by talking about tile layers. And hopefully you're aware that Esri kind of have two flavors of tile layers. They can be raster or vector. Raster's been around for a long time. It's traditional type of tile cache. Vector tiles are a little bit more recent development. And those raster tile layers provide great performance. That's what we were looking at in that earthquake app on the left-hand side, and especially for anything that has a really complex geometry. It's always optimal if that data isn't changing frequently because you'd have to recook that tile cache in order to show any new changes. So for static foundational type data, we always tend to recommend tile layers for that. They can support the ability to generate those tiles automatically when data is updated or a new area is requested by a user. So we'll talk a little bit about how you can do that within ArcGIS Online. And they can also support pop-ups. A lot of people may not realize this. They think once you cache it, that's it. There's no interactivity. But they actually can support pop-ups from that source feature data. And I'll walk through how you can do that. The vector tile layers, again, a little bit newer. Unfortunately, they're not quite as robust in terms of the things that they support as the raster tiles. They don't provide support for pop-ups, for example, but they do support custom styling. So if you are someone that wants to take a template of a vector tile data set and easily change the style, they're great for doing that. They're also great for offline mobile workflows. But in terms of high demand or viral applications, we would probably still today recommend using raster tiles over vector tiles. So some best practices about hosted tile layers in ArcGIS Online. Obviously, if you've done any caching or tiling before, you know you want to set that desired symbology before you publish. So make sure your symbology, your styles and colors and labels are all the way that you want them before you publish those tiles. And while you can you can create the tiles themselves using desktop tools in ArcMap and Pro, we highly recommend that you publish them from a hosted feature layer in ArcGIS Online. Some people don't want to do that. They say, I want to use my desktop tools, because then you avoid some credit charge for generating those tiles in the cloud. However, that credit charge has really dropped over the years. It's about 1 credit per 10,000 tiles, I think. So it's really not that heavy of a cost at this point. And when you publish from a hosted feature layer, you get some extra capabilities enabled. For example, pop-ups will automatically be enabled on your tile layer because this online system is aware of that source feature data. When you build that tile cache, build only the scales that you need. So you may have, I work with the national government, so a lot of times my users are mapping things at a national scale. If they wanted to cache something for the entire extent of the country at all scale levels, that's going to be a pretty big cache. So they may not need that at every scale. It might be a specific area of interest that you want to cache, or another technique that I can show you is the using a combination of tiles and features, where you only use tiles at small scales and you switch to features at large scales. And then when you publish from a hosted feature layer, you can also create tiles automatically, which basically enables caching on demand, which if you ever did any caching in the sort of old mode of setting up a map in ArcMap, and then you'd publish to your server and you'd cache it, you could turn on caching on demand, which basically means only start building tiles when a user requests the extent of that area. And then if you also create tiles automatically, it ensures that when that source feature data is updated, if it does change, that hosted tile layer will automatically retile that area wherever those updates occurred. So it helps, some efficiency, add some efficiency to, managing your hosted cache going forward. All right, so I'm going to take a little bit closer look at some applications here. First off, we're going to revisit this earthquake one just to remind you what that performance looked like. Hopefully it's the same on mine as it was on Beth's. Sometimes we see a little bit different. So you saw the tiles come in right away, and then you're seeing the features come in kind of in chunks, right? So have that in your mind. This is another example of a comparison app where we're looking at some statistics about changes in heights for females by country over a certain period of time. So in this case, we're visualizing polygon layers. Might have a lot of vertices, just like the earthquakes application had a lot of points. If I refresh this one, we might see a little bit different performance, right? So one app might perform differently than another. In this case, hopefully we're still seeing the tiles draw very quickly, or my internet goes out entirely and it doesn't load. But the feature service might perform differently depending on the type of data, how dense it is. So, we've made a lot of improvements into how we deliver, features over the web recently, really leveraging WebGL technology to improve that performance, but it can still be affected by, the density of features, the density of vertices, and the size of the response cache that the browser is receiving. The height change map might come in a little bit quicker than the earthquake map, and a lot of that has to do with, just the structure of your data. So really, if you're trying to decide when you should go to a tile layer versus a feature layer, it's really kind of valuable to look at it in this way with this comparison and see, does that feature layer give me the performance that I need, that I have set as a standard for my users? If not, then switch to the tiles. So just to talk a little bit more about creating those hosted tile caches, this is a hosted feature layer I have running in ArcGIS Online. It's some congressional district boundaries that I've enriched with some demographic data. If I decided I wanted to create a hosted tile layer from this, the congressional district boundaries can be very detailed and involve a lot of vertices. I can come to the item details page for that. and say I want to share this as a tile layer. So I get a little dialog here to put in obviously a title and tags, summary, and then it's going to ask, how do I want to display it with the ArcGIS Online base maps. And then it gives me the option to decide whether I want to create tiles automatically. And so that's that functionality that I said helps with any updates to this data. So if I would, if the boundary changed or some underlying, or the symbology changed or something like that, I can recreate the tiles this way. Then I want to choose the visible range. So ArcGIS Online kind of makes an initial estimate of what you might want to use as a visible range for this, but you can always adjust it. So if I don't really want to cache it down quite this low, quite that level, I could adjust the slider and just say these are the only scales that I want to create, right? And then I might switch and use the actual feature boundaries themselves from a feature service for these larger scales. So I'm not actually going to execute this, but once you set up that caching, you can always manage the tile cache just like any other tile layer where you can manually build the levels that you want. But just to show how you can set up, where you might want to use a tile cache at a tile layer at the small scales, so at a global, regional, national level. I've got a tiled version of this data already displayed here, and then you'll notice above this I have another version of the layer that's currently grayed out because what I've done is just set up a scale range, a visibility range. So as I zoom in, you'll see the tiles are still active and drawing, and at a certain point they will switch to show the feature boundaries. So here I'm looking at the feature service, and here I'm looking at the tile service. Obviously the symbology is the same, and the pop-up is configured on this tile layer, so I still get that interactivity. And once I zoom in, I obviously can still have the same pop-up on my feature layer. So this is a nice way to, not bloat your cache unnecessarily if you need to work, if you need a large extent of data. This is a good technique to use. Alrighty. All right, so now let's talk about feature layers. We've talked about tiles, we've talked a little bit about feature layers, we'll dive a little bit deeper into these. So there's sort of three versions of these. The hosted variety is obviously hosted in ArcGIS Online's cloud. So when you see that item type in ArcGIS Online, it'll have hosted in parentheses after it. These layers support editing, they support visualization and analysis, meaning that you can use them as inputs to those analysis tools in the map viewer. It also supports feature layer views, and we'll talk more about views in a couple minutes. And as we saw, they can be the source for tile layers. Now there's other types of feature layers that you might encounter in ArcGIS Online that can come from a variety of different sources. These might be ones running on your ArcGIS Enterprise instance, your own GIS server. There might be other map layers from other organizations, and it can even be files that you connect to, like a CSV file that you bring in. These also support editing, visualization, and analysis, just like the hosted feature layers. And we also have this concept of feature collections. And an easy way to remember what a feature collection is to think of the map notes functionality in the map viewer. So in that case, you're not publishing data to the server or to our hosted environment. You're really just dropping data and points and features onto the map that are stored as text. So the web map itself is really just a JSON file on the back end. So when we use map notes, we're really just adding some more text to that JSON file. It's not powered by any sort of database on the back end or by a GIS service. So this is useful for small data sets, maybe under 1,000 features that don't need the full power of a server behind them because they're very lightweight and it's a small data set. And they're very easy to create when you're doing simple mapping, right? All right, so some best practices for feature layers. Again, depending on your organization's, policies and security stances, this may not be an option, but we would always recommend you publish any public layers to ArcGIS Online and let ArcGIS Online take on the burden of managing all that infrastructure and providing the scalability and responsiveness that you would need for these viral maps. Ensure that editing is disabled on the layer. So even if you're not presenting the layer in an application that has an editing tool in it, we still recommend that you disable editing if you can, if it's not required for your other workflows. And the reason for this is because editing layers can't take advantage of some of the response caching that we do on the back end, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. So it means that we're making a request to the database every time. And then another best practice is to use these feature layer views where appropriate. And we'll walk through a demo where we set up some feature layer views so you can see how they're used. So I mentioned response caching. So what do we mean by that? So ArcGIS Online is obviously built with this logic to add more resources when needed, when things go viral and there's high demand for them. So we make queries to this feature data and what we call tile queries, where we ask for the data back in those squares. So when you saw on the earthquake app, when that feature layer on the right-hand side was drawing, you saw it coming in, like the bottom quadrant drew, then the top right quadrant drew, and then it went to another one. So that's an example of those tile queries coming back. Not to be confused with tile layers that we talked about. Sometimes we're not great at naming things. So these tile queries and the response caching, really help allow ArcGIS Online to efficiently store these requests and helps these complex vector data sets to be easily retrieved without putting unnecessary load on the servers or on the underlying database. So we have these different levels of response caching. The browser cache, which is on your end user's computer. So whoever that end user is, they are opening it on their phone or their laptop or whatever. Their browser is doing a cache of that data being queried. Then we also make use of a content delivery network. And then we also use what we call the feature tile cache on the server side on ArcGIS Online servers. So really what happens is a user hits an application, a query is made to the feature layer. We look and say, well, all right, does the browser cache, does the person's local browser cache have the latest data? If not, all right, does the content delivery network powered by the cloud services, does that cache have the latest data? If not, does that feature tile cache on ArcGIS Online servers have the latest data? And finally, if none of those are the most up to date, then we go back and execute a new query to the database. And so again, when you enable editing on your feature layer, pretty much all of that these three middle icons are wiped out and we go directly back to the database, which is not necessarily going to provide the best performance. So to just point out one difference between the public and private layers, we're talking mostly about the public version here, but just so you're aware, if you have layers in ArcGIS Online that you are not sharing publicly, they are private to your organization, we skip that content delivery network bit in the middle. So they don't get to take advantage of those. Obviously, browsers can still cache those layers or cache those requests, and then the feature tile cache on our servers still works, but they don't get to take advantage of the CDN network, just so you're aware of that one. Okay, so I've mentioned a couple times these feature layer views, and so they really come into play when we talk about making public layers available on data that needs to be edited in some way. So there's a couple scenarios outlined here. The first one is a really common scenario that I think a lot of our users struggled with for a long time before we enabled feature layer views. And that's the case where you have a feature service running there in the cloud, and maybe it's something that your organization is updating. You have people out in the field doing data collection, making edits to that layer. But at the same time, you also needed to be able to display it in a public application. And so this was causing some heartache for people when they couldn't, if you make that layer editable so that your data collectors can update it, that means it's technically editable by anyone, by the general public if it's shared publicly. So the views really help us get around this problem by being able to create a public display view of that data. And a view is really just a different endpoint in the ArcGIS Online system with a different configuration, but ultimately pointing to the same data in the database. So in that First example, it might be, the American Red Cross is operating shelters and they're standing up new shelter locations. Their internal staff need to be able to add locations to the map of where their shelters are running, but they also want to display that information to the public. So they can have their private version of the data that's editable, and then have a public version that's view only. And then the general public, there's no way for the general public to find an editable version of the layer. The second scenario that we'll walk through is looking at the instance where you might have a crowdsourcing or citizen science application. In this case, you're trying to let the public submit data to you. So you do need an editable version of the layer that is public facing, but it's probably a good idea to have an internal version that you can also edit in order to sort of review or curate the data that's coming in. And then you might have a final public display version showing the data that's been reviewed by your internal employees. So we're going to walk through a scenario, a couple scenarios actually, to set up these hosted layer views. All right. So first off, this is a example demo app where we're displaying shelter locations across an extent. And if you see, some of these look normal, but there's obviously something suspicious going on here. So if this is the public version of this app, I don't have any editing tools here. How would someone have been able to do this and put inappropriate content onto our map? Well, if they're savvy enough, right, and this is a public-facing layer, they can go to ArcGIS Online and search for it and find a layer that's editable that they can open in a web map and start editing. So they could do that by searching in ArcGIS Online. If they're really savvy, they can sniff out the web traffic. They can use your browser tools to look at the traffic coming into this app and find the ArcGIS Online ID of that layer and then go look it up, right? So there's sneaky people that do that. So this is the layer itself within the map viewer in ArcGIS Online. Notice that I'm accessing this anonymously, so I'm not signed in right now. But as an anonymous user, I can still come in here and edit this and add more features, and I can put something over here that says LOL, and this thing's full. Okay, so there's a new point, right? And if I go back here and refresh this, I should see the new point, right? So again, if someone finds this layer, they're able to open it anonymously in ArcGIS Online, they're able to do this sort of stuff. So we want to be conscious of how we're sharing our layers. So in a sort of citizen science example, this was an example around letting people submit ideas for where a city should locate new trash cans. You're a dog walker and you don't find enough conveniently located trash cans, so you want to submit something to the city to tell them to put one there. So this is a hosted feature layer that, if we take a look at the schema for this, notice there's a reviewed field. So this is a field that we're going to use to flag whether or not the employees of the city have said that this is appropriate content and can pass through to the public view of the data. And then there's just a couple fields, whatever other attributes you want to allow people to describe where they want a trash can and what type of road it's located on. This layer is currently not shared. So it is private to the owner, or private to the organization at least. But if we look at the settings, we can see that editing is enabled, and all different types of edits are allowed. So we're allowing the owner of this or our internal users to add, update, and delete features. So if we would, open this in a map viewer and save it into a web map, and demo. If I save this, and then if I tried to share this publicly, I'm going to get prompted to, look at the layer that's in here, and it's saying, hey, warning, you're sharing this publicly, but this layer has editing enabled. So if you also choose to share this layer publicly, it means everyone can edit it. So we have tried to put some warnings and best practices directly into the software. But if I hit update sharing right now, it would make that editable layer public. So rather than doing that, we're gonna use feature layer views in order to make a slightly more intelligent workflow and experience for our end users. So let me go back to the page for this. So if I want to create a view layer, it's right here on the overview tab of the item details for your feature layer. So it basically just brings up a dialog that should look very familiar anytime you're saving an item, right? You have a title, tags, summary, folder, all that good stuff. So once that view is created, again, it's a new item in your content, but it's still referencing the same data that the original hosted feature layer is. So I'm going to take a look, switch a tab here. So this is a view that we already created off of that same feature service. We've named it Trash Can Locations Collect. So this is the data that we want to allow our public users, the view that we want our public users to have to submit information, to collect information about where we should place trash cans. So in this case, this layer would have different settings on it. Or this view would have different settings on it. So if I look at the schema for this one, notice we're not exposing the review field. So that review field is just for our internal employees to flag whether the submission is valid and appropriate and okay, but we're not exposing that field to our public users. And then the settings, the edited settings for this, editing is still enabled. But we're only allowing the public to add features. They're not able to delete anything or update any other existing records. All they can do is submit new points. So there's fine-grained control that you can apply to the editing rights. Excuse me. So yeah, add only. Oh, and the other one to point out here was that the editors can't see any features, even the ones that they add. So in this case, we don't want the editors to see any features until they've been reviewed. So we're turning off that capability for this particular public view, the collection view. So we can take this layer and put it into a web map that powers maybe a GeoForm application like this, or maybe it's a Survey 123 app or something that lets people submit their locations of where they want trash cans to be submitted. So we can say, put a can here, and I'll say side street, and I can give it a location. Oops. We'll zoom in somewhere here. Let's click around here somewhere. Alrighty, submit my entry. So I've submitted something, I get feedback, that's great, been submitted. So now if I would look at the submissions, it's not actually going to show me any data because we turned that capability off of that view layer. So I don't actually see any of those entries that anyone has put on there. The map is blank. So now, as the city that's reviewing these coming in, I would go back to my original editable layer and review that information. And then share that information into a display app once it's been reviewed. So in this case, I'm going to show you the other view real quick here. So this one. So the second view that we've created is what we're calling view only. So there's no editing available on this version of the data. So editing is not enabled. And then this one would be shared publicly so that it can be put into some public-facing application where users can view the submitted points. So hopefully, if I refresh this right now, we're not going to see the one that I submitted because it hasn't been reviewed yet. So we're still just seeing, the original points, hopefully, or any points. Maybe not. Give them a second. All right, we'll come back to that one. But basically, I'm going to go back to my original version of the data, the original hosted layer. And if I open this in the map viewer, and I should be able to see all of the data that's been submitted here. And I could look at one of these and say, all right, this was the one that I just submitted. If I edit this, I'm going to change that reviewed flag to yes. So once that reviewed flag says that it's been approved, now it's available through our public view of the data to our end users. So I can kind of isolate those changes, make sure only the ones that are approved are then shared. Let me try to refresh this one more time. Maybe it'll come back. There we go. And hopefully, yep, this is the one that I just reviewed. All right, so hopefully that wasn't too confusing, and it was a lot of switching between tabs that all kind of look the same. But the idea is that we have a source feature layer that we can create different views with different permissions, whether that's editing, viewing, attributes that are exposed. They can all be controlled by these layer views without you kind of exposing any of your internal data dangerously to the public for any bad actors to act on. Okay. All right, so just to wrap up with some visualization strategies to think about as you're kind of polishing your apps and deciding, going back to some of those topics that Beth talked about in terms of performance and usability and functionality. So oftentimes you're dealing with large amounts of data. And so if that data goes viral, we want to make sure that we're presenting it in the most efficient way possible. As we mentioned, this could be through tile layers or a feature tile combo. But there's other ways to help manage the size of the data that you're trying to present to the end user. Maybe you're using a filter. Maybe it makes sense to only present a certain subset of the data. But again, that's going to be impacted by the story that you're trying to tell with that data and your web application. You might also aggregate, especially we've made a lot of improvements to the aggregation workflows and providing some easy to use boundaries for you to aggregate to. You don't have to provide your own boundaries if you don't have them. We can use standard administrative boundaries from the Living Atlas or like hex bins in the screenshot there. Using those visibility ranges, again, to control when that data is presented to the user. It doesn't make sense necessarily to show all data at all scales. So you can use those visibility ranges to turn those on and off. Also think about maybe generalizing the data. Oftentimes the most detailed polygon boundaries aren't necessary to convey whatever it is you're trying to say about the data. I do this often with the congressional district boundaries since they can be quite detailed. But at a national scale, you don't necessarily need all that detailed vertices in the data set. Also think about clustering. Obviously for points, this works if you've got, for example, the earthquake data. Maybe that makes sense to cluster and show at large or at small scales, where there's a greater density of these earthquakes occurring. And then as you zoom in, you turn that clustering off and you can look at the individual features. That's another common technique. So just, continue to think about these as potential options for handling those large amounts of data. And so then just one last note, a reminder on sharing. When you are sharing these apps publicly and they are going viral, as Beth's demo showed, some of those apps might be leveraging content that requires you to authenticate into ArcGIS Online. So the Living Atlas provides a lot of really great pre-rendered layers, used a lot in emergency management in terms of natural hazards and disasters and weather and things like that you may want to include in your app, but just be aware that as you're building your map and you're signed into ArcGIS Online, they're obviously displaying for you, but once an anonymous viewer tries to load the app, it's going to say, oh wait, this person's not signed in, this is a subscription or premium layer, so we need to authenticate, and they're going to be prompted to log in. So as with your web map and other source data that's in your application, make sure that we're setting up the right proxies to pass through credentials for the subscription and premium content. And I'm assuming we have time to do this, so we'll take a quick look at that. If I go back to that same application that Beth was showing, this is that precipitation forecast, time enabled. On the general tab, this particular application, has some settings that we can configure. One of those here is flagging that subscriber content. So it's pointing out that this National Weather Service layer is actually subscription content that we need to provide a proxy for. So all I really have to do is check this box. You have some options to limit the number of requests that are coming through. Particularly useful if it's a credit consuming service, like some of the demographic layers in ArcGIS Online. If you don't, if there's any danger of the, so many requests coming through that it's, taking a hit to your credit bucket, you can request that, or you can make a limit on that request. But even those are pretty small in terms of credit charge. We really charge by the view, which is pan or zoom around the map. So it's highly unlikely that users are going to do that so many times that it's going to result in consuming all of your credits. But the option is there if you want it. So as long as you check that box, save this app configuration, the next time we go to load this as an anonymous user, we're no longer going to be prompted to log in. So we tried to provide some easy pathways for you to make sure that isn't a bad experience for your end user. Okay, so just to wrap up, some key takeaways in summary. What we talked about here today is making sure you're thinking about your map's audience and purpose, right? So is it for GIS analysts, technical subject matter experts? Is it for decision makers? Is it for the general public? Is it for your mom, right? So who are you authoring it for? What are you trying to tell them? How much functionality do they really need? There's usually a trade-off between functionality and usability and functionality and performance, right? Make sure you choose the right layer types. And again, this might involve a little bit of testing. If you initially set up your data as features, you're looking at those load times and it's not the experience that you want to provide, then you might switch and look at tile layers, or maybe choose some visualization strategy to help with that. Optimizing those feature layers for response caching and editing workflows. If you can disable editing, do so that you take advantage of response caching, but if not, leverage those feature layer views to help with privacy concerns of your data and making sure it's being used appropriately. And then get creative with your visualization techniques to help tell the right story about your data and present just the information that people need. So some resources, there's a few blogs that contain a lot of the information that we went over today. So feel free to screenshot this, and the slides will also be available after the conference if you want to wait for those to come out. And then always recommend following the ArcGIS Online blog. So you can just copy down that URL and get to the main blog page, and you can choose the ArcGIS Online topic. So it's a really great resource to follow to see what's new, best practices, tips and tricks, things like that. So please take the survey on the Events app. If you've been at any of these sessions, hopefully you've heard this already. Just open the app, go to the schedule, find this session, and go to the feedback tab and give us some feedback. We always appreciate it. And with that, we're happy to take some questions. Yeah?
When you disable editing, are you disabling it for every web map with that layer existing, or just for that specific?
So if it's so if you disable the editing on the settings tab of the item details page, that is that's globally wherever that layer is used, right?
Inside the web map.
Oh, so the question was if you disable editing inside the web map, that's only at the web map level. So again, it's even if you weren't providing a web map or an application that allows editing, if that source feature layer is still editable in the system, a bad actor could get in there, sniff out the web traffic, find that source layer, open it in a brand new web map, and do nefarious things with it. Yeah.
Kind of a similar question. If you have features that you want to use for analysis but you don't want to actually show on the map, you can filter them on the web map.
Yes.
But again, someone could go in and find the source data and find those features. Is there a way with those feature layers to kind of, I guess, hide the shape and the location while maintaining, like to the public while still maintaining that information so we can use it for analysis?
So I think if I can get the question right, they want to be able to use the feature layers for analysis, but in a public view, not allow the public to do any analysis on them, you mean?
To view that.
Just to view only?
So you can bin them, you could maybe aggregate them at a higher level.
Yeah, sure.
But you can't actually do the polygons.
Bin them or aggregate them? I'm not sure I'm following, but okay, yeah, we can cycle back afterwards. But my first thought was tiles, again, would be one use case, right? So you expose the tile layer, the cached layer publicly,
Right.
and no one can, edit or do any analysis or anything like that. And you can turn the pop-ups off if you don't even want them to query it. But then your hosted feature layer is still available for you to run analysis on if you want it. Not sure if that totally addresses it, but feel free to stop by afterwards. Yeah.
What about the data layers that are hosted by Esri, for example, the hurricane data layer? I've noticed that when we featured that data layer on our maps, when there's a hurricane that's about to hit, for example, oftentimes that data layer, after getting so many hits, will actually go under itself. Is there a way to help with that, or?
So the question was is it a Living Atlas layer, I'm assuming? So an Esri hosted layer in the Living Atlas showing hurricane data. When it's hit a lot, you're saying it stops performing well? It just stops drawing altogether? Okay. I probably would love to hear some feedback on that. If you want to come see us and let us know which layer it is exactly, we can let the Living Atlas team know if it's something and how they've shared it or architected it that we can do to improve the performance. Yeah. Yeah.
So I understand what you were saying about hosting a feature layer and then sharing it as a tile service. When you share as a service from ArcMap, when you do the tile feature layer, it shows you the impact of what the tile caching is going to be, but I didn't see on screen when you did it.
Yeah.
ArcGIS Online, what the
Yep.
impact is going to be in terms of data size. So
Yeah.
can you get statistics on that?
Yeah, so the question was if for desktop users that are setting up their cache in the desktop environment, there's a dialog when you publish that, when you define your scale levels, it shows you kind of the size of the tile cache, the estimated size of what that tile cache is going to be. We didn't show that here today, but it is something that's available. If I can pop open one of my other layers. Go. This is mine, yeah, okay. So if I go to settings, so for my tile layer, if I go to show the current tile details here, this shows me the storage used by each of those levels. So again, I didn't show the actual building workflow, but if you want to come in and manually build the tiles, rather than just letting them happen on demand as people query the data, you can come in here and manually build these tiles and define, okay, go ahead and create this scale level. It's only going to take this much. So, you can kind of piecemeal it and make sure that you're not, creating a huge amount of storage on your account if that's what you want to do. So this gives you some visibility into that. So yeah, it's here. I just didn't show this during the demo, but it's basically once you've created the tile layer as an item, you can go to its settings page and explore these in a little bit more detail. And then if I go in and build tiles, I can come in and add more scale levels and execute the actual cache. So settings tab. Does that help?
When you go to the build tiles
Yeah.
utility inside ArcGIS Online, you will get some sort of view of estimated.
Well, these are already built, so actually.
Let me just quick check that.
Yeah, we'll double check. Come see us afterwards, just checking to make sure that it gives you an estimate. I mean, I can see here that these couple levels here at the bottom weren't actually complete, but I still have some storage here, so I think it's going to do what you're expecting, but we'll double check. Yeah.
I think it might give you a credit estimation.
Okay. Anyone else? Yeah.
You say you can't associate pop-up information in ArcGIS Pro or Map as to be done online?
With a tile layer, you mean?
Tile layer.
Yeah. So the question was, where can you associate a pop-up, a feature layer to use as your pop-up information on a tile layer? Is it only done in the web, or can you do it on the desktop? I'm not sure. I've never tested it in desktop, so I've never tried it. But I don't think I don't. Another gentleman shaking his head no. So I haven't seen that, but it is obviously something you can do in the web. And you don't. If you didn't use the feature layer as the, if you didn't publish your tile layer from the hosted feature layer, maybe you created the cache on your desktop and then you uploaded it and created a hosted tile layer, you can still enable pop-ups on that layer in the map viewer. It's just a manual process that you have to go through to, say, okay, use this hosted feature layer as the source data for the pop-ups. Whereas if you publish it directly in the browser, it's done automatically for you. Anyone else? All right, thank you guys very much. Enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thank you.